Hello. Wonderful greetings of the day to all my divine brothers and sisters. Dear friends, today I would like to start with a basic quiz. That is, I'm going to show you a certain picture and you have to recognize what does this basically symbolize. Yes, many of you have got it right. It's the Prime Minister, respected Modi ji, and who is sitting with the Chinese President, respected Xi Jinping sir. Actually, it's the 2014 picture where both of them are having a dialogue on the swing. Now, what's the next picture? Obviously, many of you are getting it right, my dear friends. It's the India-China border. It's the India-China border, and here most of the areas are named. That is Tibet, Ladakh, and the related areas. Obviously, it's the India-China border, and actually many of you have got to know that today's topic of discussion. Yes, today's topic of discussion is basically to explore the relationship between India and China, and the detailed discussion of what does the future of the bilateral strategic ties between the two regions basically lie. So here it goes. My dear friends, we are basically quite aware of how China outmaneuvered the Modi government and seized the control of territory along the line of actual control. And especially the 2020 crisis has been a big lesson for all of us. And a map of the India-China border in Ladakh depicting the 1956 and 1960 claim lines of China, as well as the lines of actual control before and after the 1962 Sino-Indian War. And the next spread is actually the satellite image of the Ladakh landscape with close-up of the infrastructure built in the area. Control has been denied by not allowing the Indian military to patrol several areas it regularly accessed before. For the first time in 45 years, on 15th June 2020, India and China recorded the death of Indian soldiers on the line of actual control, that is the LAC. The contested border between the two countries, which stretches from the Karakoram Pass in the west to Myanmar in the east. The deaths occurred in the Galvan Valley in Ladakh, and these were the first military casualties in the territory since the 1962 Sino-India War. The full details of the incident are basically shrouded in ambiguity, but it involved Chinese soldiers pitching tents around the Galvan Valley and their forceful eviction by the Indian Army. There is actually a little clarity on whether China's People's Liberation Army had agreed to abandon these positions. This basically led to a clash which claimed the lives of 20 Indian soldiers and at least 4 PLS soldiers. This is a very sad incident, my dear friends. More than 70 Indian soldiers were injured while nearly 100 more, including some officers, were taken captive by the Chinese. No Chinese soldier was in the Indian captivity. We were taken by surprise by how well prepared they were for the clash. A top officer at the army headquarters in Delhi, who was part of the decision making in Ladakh crisis, told me. The line of actual control, that is the LAC, has neither been delineated on the map nor demarcated on the ground by either side. The last attempt to do so failed nearly 2 decades ago. The difference in the two sides' understanding of it is so vast that New Delhi claims the border between the two countries is 3,488 kilometers long, while China says it is only around 2,000. It is the world's longest disputed border. As the two countries, India and China, do not agree on where the actual control exercised by either side ends, both India and China are actually engaged in an uncompromising contest of asserting control over small parcels of land in a desolate Himalayan wasteland. The demonstration of territorial claims can take several forms, including soldiers patrolling up to certain points, building infrastructure along the border, and controlling the limits to which people in border villages are allowed to graze their animals. The unforgiving terrain and harsh weather have not dissuaded India and China from deploying around 50,000 additional soldiers each on the 832-kilometer line of actual control in Ladakh since the summer of 2020. Dear friends, I would also like to mention the fact here that I am currently in the hospital. I am currently being hospitalized for a certain ailment, and I'm mentioning this fact because there is a lot of noise in the background and sometimes it increases, though I have taken the necessary precautions of closing the door and other necessary precautions so that there is minimum disturbance, but still certain commotion arises which is beyond my control. So I apologize for the same. Now let's continue with the session. The deadly Galvan clash occurred at patrolling point PP14, an area that was until then disputed and which the Indian Army patrolled regularly. Days after it, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi declared in Delhi that the Chinese had not intruded into our border, nor has any post been taken over by them. An attempt by saving face that China gleefully seized upon as proof that it had not encroached upon the Indian territory. The overall clamor around the deaths and the release of the captive Indian soldiers, however, had blown the lid off the government's attempts to play down the crisis in Ladakh. The overall situation had already come to public notice in India a month earlier because of the massive physical clashes on the north bank of the Pangong Lake, also in Ladakh. There were severe injuries on both sides, but no deaths. These major episodes marked the marked the border crisis of the summer of 2020, even though tension had been building for months before that. 2.5 years later, the state of ties between the two neighboring countries can be aptly described as no war, no peace. I repeat once again, no war, no peace. It's a very, very different kind of dialogue. This was an expression used by the military officers more than 2 decades. It was more than 2 decades ago to describe the situation on the border in the restive Kashmir region between India and Pakistan, the line of control, that is the LOC. The two situations are basically materially different, but the terminology makes a connection that was pointed out to me by a senior Indian military commander who was involved in handling the Ladakh crisis. When I asked him about the thinking that impelled military actions leading into the crisis in summer of 2020, it said, do not treat China on the line of actual control like Pakistan on the LOC. I repeat, do not treat China on the line of actual control like Pakistan on the line of control, that is LOC. So, while India had dominated Pakistan militarily on the line of control with aggressive actions for nearly 3 decades, that is 30 years, similar attempts against China have led to adverse outcomes. Since 2020, the PLA had denied India control over at least 1,000 square kilometers of territory, according to most media reports. Others, such as Manoj Joshi, in his new book, Understanding the India-China Border, the Enduring Threat of War in High Himalaya, estimate it to be 2,000 square kilometer. Control has been denied by not allowing the Indian military to patrol several areas it regularly accessed before. The PLA has constructed massive infrastructure in the contested regions, including airfields, helicopters, habitats, roads, and bridges, which have been documented by the satellite imagery. India is basically struggling to find a way to reverse the Chinese incursions. New Delhi has deployed a mass of soldiers to prevent any further loss to the Chinese, but no longer insists on the restoration of the situation as it existed in Ladakh in April 2020. The Chinese have basically altered the status quo permanently. So this is the most open acknowledgement yet. No longer describing it as a border dispute, Beijing now calls it as a sovereignty issue, which makes any compromise on India's terms difficult. The two countries, India and China, have agreed to step back by a few kilometers each in the Galvan Valley, the north bank of the Pangong on the Pangong, from Finger 3 to Finger 8, military terms for mountain ridges extending into the lake. The mountain passes Rezangla and Rezangla in the Kailash range at the patrolling point PP17A at Gogra, and as of September this year at PP15 at Kurang Nala. So there is basically an overall moratorium on patrolling in these buffer zones. So by agreeing to them, India has in effect ceded control over its own claimed territories. The Indian Army can no longer control patrol areas it had access to earlier, nor are the residents of these areas satisfied as the new limitation also denied them from grazing areas, affecting their livelihoods. Recent media reports state that people living in the border villages see the latest disengagements as India surrendering control of its territory. After the September disengagement at PP15, a spokesperson of the Chinese Foreign Ministry ruled out any return to the April 2020, asserting that Beijing does not accept the so-called status quo created by India's illegal crossing of the line of actual control. So the Chinese have basically altered the status quo permanently, essentially presenting India with a fait accompli. No longer describing it as a border dispute, Beijing now calls it a sovereignty issue, which makes any compromise on India's terms a lot more difficult. In the 16 rounds of talks between the senior commanders of the two armies of two respective countries, the Chinese have basically refused to discuss the military important areas, the important militarily areas of Depsang and Demchok, where earlier standoffs took place in 2013 and 2015 respectively. While we have made significant progress, General Manoj Pandey, the Chief of Army Staff, recently said at a public event, "We still have two friction points where we need to move forward. We are hopeful that by talking both at the diplomatic and military level, we will be able to find a resolution. That is our main aim before we look at de-escalation." Bereft of alternatives since the crisis began, New Delhi has been constrained to shifting its forces away from the border with its traditional adversary, Pakistan, and to China border instead. In order to avoid the nightmare of a two-front war, the Modi government in 2020 asked the United Arab Emirates, that is UAE, to actually intervene in talks with Pakistan, reversing a long withstanding Indian policy of no third-party mediation. In February 2021, this actually led to a reiteration of the 2003 ceasefire along the line of control and the opening of back-channel communications with the Pakistani establishment. So, these perceived signs of weakness vis-a-vis Pakistan and China are basically the anathema. They are basically the anathema to the Modi's strongman image. His hyper-nationalist government has chosen an undemocratic domestic strategy of keeping the Indian public in the dark by not formally providing any authentic information about the ground situation along the border, denying access to the journalists and blocking questions and discussions in the parliament. According to Kenneth Juster, the US ambassador to India between 2017 and 2021, the Modi government asked Washington DC to not mention China's border aggression in its statements. The overall opacity can be a short-term fix, but it contains the seeds of a bigger crisis that cannot be kept concealed for long. Meanwhile, even on the eastern side of the line of actual control, that is LAC, the senior military commanders have confirmed the reports of China building significant new infrastructure, building bridges, roads, and accommodation for troops. Arunachal Pradesh shares a 1,126-kilometer border with China, while Sikkim shares a 220-kilometer border. In 2019, Tapir Gaon, a Bharatiya Janata Party MP from Arunachal Pradesh, told the Lok Sabha that China had occupied 50 to 60 kilometers of Indian territory. If there will be a Doklam-like standoff in the future, it will be in Arunachal Pradesh, he said, referring to a major 2017 standoff between the two countries, India and China. In January 2021, the media reported a minor face-off at Nakula in North Sikkim. Pandey basically spoke about the existing gaps that needed to be filled on this side of the line of actual control. So in the context of our eastern region, where there is a lot to be done, we are focusing on creating infrastructure, road connectivity right up to the border, he said. So despite these continuing tensions along the line of actual control, that is the LAC, the Modi government is basically political and is quite economically pressurizing against China through the ban on apps, stringent rules on investments, and raids on Chinese companies in order to gain leverage that has been weak at most. In diplomatic talks, Indian representatives are no longer demanding a reset to be actually at a status quo of April 2020. At the annual summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization held in Uzbekistan this September, that is in 2022, Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping shared a stage for the first time since the Ladakh crisis, but held no bilateral talks. They did not even greet each other after posing for a group photo. This basically belied the bonhomie the two men supposedly shared over many years, about which much has been written in the Indian media. And one thing I would like to bring to your notice, my dear friends, the picture that we showed to you in the beginning, that is of 2014. That is before this 2020 line of actual control war, which took place in 2020. At that time in 2014, India and China, the representatives of both the countries, were discussing in detail how to bilaterally strengthen the overall strategic ties between the two countries. That's in 2014. But the 2020 incident has actually changed the entire situation. Now, going forward, Modi himself has a long association with China. When he was denied a visa by the United States after the 2002 Gujarat pogroms, he became a frequent traveler to India's northern neighbor. On each occasion, he supposedly returned with commitments of greater Chinese investment in Gujarat. While campaigning before in 2014 general election, Modi expressed admiration for the Chinese model and said India should replicate it. And the overall arithmetic and chemistry of our relations convinced me that together we can actually script history and create a better tomorrow for all of the mankind. This is a very, very strong statement if we read it in today's context. He said this after his first meeting with Xi in the 2014 BRICS summit in Brazil. 8 years later, that assessment lies in tatters. That's what we have just discussed. Thanks to the Modi government, hyper-nationalist propaganda, such is the distance of public perception from reality, that the recent survey of 7,000 Indians by the Simon Center found that 69.3% of respondents said India would definitely or probably defeat both China and Pakistan in a war, with the figure climbing to nearly 90% for defeating only Pakistan. This is a very, very strong estimate, and by God's grace, we would obviously fulfill this. Yes, we will fulfill this. We will make this true. These deluded views further add to the existing risk of conflict in Ladakh due to the augmented deployment of soldiers by both armies within the close proximity in disputed areas. A public that mistakenly thinks a military victory is a foregone conclusion for India presses the government to go further in its optics to keep that expectation alive, hence creating the conditions I'm sorry for the delay. Hence, creating the conditions for bigger blunders. So we should not go actually on the expectations. We must, otherwise that may create the blunders, that may create bigger blunders when we meet the actual reality. Indian and Chinese troops and tanks disengaged in the Kailash range in February 2021, where they had been deployed quite opposite to each other for about 6 months. The Indian government uses the phrase of friction points to describe the areas of PLA ingress. It is exactly this friction that has the capacity to light a bigger fire. Yes. Then in August 2019, months after the Modi government was voted into power for a second time, it actually squashed the semi-autonomous status of Jammu and Kashmir It actually simultaneously bifurcated the state of Jammu and Kashmir into the two union territories of Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir respectively. The Home Minister Amit Shah vowed in the parliament to give his life for the integrity of Jammu and Kashmir. He added that he further added that the territory included Akai-Chin, which is controlled by China but claimed by India in its maps. Beijing reacted strongly, urging New Delhi to be cautious in its words and deeds on the border issue, strictly abide by the relevant agreements reached between the two sides, and avoid talking the strong statements, and hence taking actions that further complicate the border issue. In a broader perspective, it means that China was warning India to act as per its terms and conditions, in which India should not cross its limits of even thinking to claim Aksai-Chin as its province. Modi rushed his foreign minister Mr. S. Jaishankar to Beijing to placate the Chinese, but to little avail. A few days later, in an informal closed-door session of the United Nations Security Council (UNSC), the Chinese representative lodged a protest saying India's actions had challenged the Chinese sovereign interests and violated bilateral agreements on maintaining peace and stability in the border areas. The overall statements continued from Beijing, and the satellite imagery analyzed by Chris Biggers, the basic director of the geopolitical analytics company Hawkeye 360, suggested that China broke ground on much of the military related infrastructure near the border in August 2019 or shortly thereafter. These signs of trouble were missed as New Delhi was smitten by the prospect of Xi's visit to actually Mamalpuram near China in October that year for an informal summit with Modi. Chennai was actually the second informal summit between the two leaders. The year before, both men, Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi Jinping, had promised to provide the strategic guidance to these respective militaries at the first such meeting in their province Wuhan, held at Modi's request. These summits were seen as signaling a reset of the bilateral ties after the 2017 Doklam crisis by building on a personal equation between Xi and Modi. An editorial in China Daily, Beijing's flagship English newspaper, stated that the Chinese summit demonstrated that the two government bodies, Modi government and the Xi government, that the two governments, Modi government and the Xi government, cherish the opportunity to improve the bilateral ties through the personal chemistry between their top leaders. So, in the opening remarks at the summit, Mr. Modi coined the basic catchphrase Chennai Connect to mark the start of a new era of cooperation between the two countries. A senior editor at the First Post wrote that we are slowly moving into an era of personal diplomacy where the bilateral strategic ties between the nations are better managed through relation between the top leadership instead of structured systems. Considering that this was the 17th meeting between Xi and Modi since both assumed office, the things seemed rosy as the two leaders posed for the photographs in Tamil Nadu. So this was obviously a positive sign of the overall smoothening of the relationship between India and China. But as all of us know, a few years later, the things got reversed completely. What the Indian public did not know was that tensions had been brewing since at least a month earlier, and at Pangong Tso, a scenic 135-kilometer long saltwater lake of which 2/3 is controlled by China. The Indian commander in the area had been trying to improve his positions on the north bank to the basic resentment of the PLA. The lake and its north bank is a disputed area and often the site of tensions, including shoving and jostling on occasion between the soldiers of both sides. The commander, who has served in the area many times in various ranks over the past 15 years, accepted that the Indian military leadership in Ladakh should have been able to foresee China's assessment and its likely response. So, in the wake of Shah's statement on Aksai Chin, as we had quoted earlier, the actions of the local Indian commander were perhaps interpreted very differently, leading to the events escalating quickly into a big clash between the two sides, India and China. After the clash in September, the injured Indian soldiers had to be flown to Leh. The push for better tactical positions continued after the winter, building up to a major clash on 5th May 2020. As all of us are quite aware, it was basically a very, very major clash and a great historical event between India and China. In early 2020, in the Depsang Plains, close to Karakoram Pass and part of the military vital Daulat Beg Oldie sector, the PLA violated an informal understanding allowing the mutual patrolling up to a certain distance beyond a place called Bottleneck or Y Junction. A Chinese patrol breached that understanding and came up to China's claim line near Woods. As a step of retaliation, the Indian Army decided to block PLA patrols at the bottleneck. The PLA responded by parking some vehicles at the same place and blocking India's access to 5 patrolling points: PP-10, PP-11, PP-11A, PP-12 and PP-13 along the Raki and Jeevan streams. This had been the site of a previous standoff in 2013, which was basically resolved in 2 weeks with a reciprocal Indian action in Chumar in southeastern Ladakh. At the time, both sides agreed to withdraw their troops from the disputed area. The early warnings, actually facilitated by strategic surveillance, should enable us to deploy at our perceived line of actual control to check ingress, while we simultaneously resort to a quid pro quo, as we did during the Dapsang intrusion in 2013. The Lieutenant General K.T. Patnaik, a former chief of the Northern Command, told the Indian Express in July 2020, "Early response creates leverage and that matters." But no such early response was forthcoming from the Indian side in 2020. So, unrelated to all this, the Indian Army had decided to improve its access to PP-14 by constructing a 60-meter Bailey Bridge on a rivulet beyond the Shock River, so that its patrolling parties could also travel in vehicles, as was the case with the PLA. This was to cut the time taken to reach the patrolling time by several hours to a certain point. After the Galvan clash that June, the Chinese state-owned broadcaster CCTV showed footage from the early summer of Indian Army reconnaissance teams trying to find the best alignment in the area. This effort was basically contested by the Chinese and became a major flashpoint between the two sides. Tensions quickly erupted, and an Indian helicopter carrying a local military commander was reportedly chased down and harassed mid-air by the PLA. The senior military commander involved in the Ladakh crisis told me that there were all discrete tactical incidents, but the Chinese chose to connect the dots and saw them as part of the larger Indian plan. The commander who was served, whose entire lifetime was served in the area, many times in various ranks over the past 15 years, accepted that the Indian military leadership in Ladakh should have been able to foresee China's assessment and its likely response. Even Indian surveillance and investigation facilities with full intelligence failed to provide a warning, as the PLA moved two divisions from nearby exercise areas to the LAC, that is the line of actual control in Ladakh, and took the control of areas claimed and patrolled by India. So, it basically painted a huge map of China, its national flag, and a slogan in the Mandarin district near Finger 4 and 5 on the north bank of Pangong Lake, which were distinctly visible in the satellite imagery. By this time, the Indian Army was unable to patrol on Despang, Pangong, Gogra, Hot Spring, and Demchok, while a no patrol zone had been created in the Galvan Valley after the clash. India also built up its forces and had nearly 50,000 additional soldiers in the area by the autumn. In India, the decision-making power on China India ties basically lies with the China Steady Group, an informal group of top officials that was earlier headed by the Foreign Secretary, but for the past few years has been convened and run by the National Security Advisor Ajit Doval. Since 2003, the NSA, that is the National Security Advisor, has also been the special representative for the border talks with China. Officials quoted in media reports have basically said that the CSG has got all the people required to take the decisions on China's affairs and is an integral part of that structure to manage the line of actual control, that is the LAC. As it is not a formal body, its overall deliberations and decisions are neither discussed in Parliament nor in any parliamentary committees. So a bureaucrat has attended the CSG meetings under Doval told me that the nature of the group changed with Jaishankar and at times the Defense Minister Rajnath Singh as well as the Chief of Defense Staff General Bipin Rawat being part of the overall deliberations at the peak of the Ladakh crisis. The CSG was actually keeping a close watch on the Ladakh crisis and close control of the agenda and points to be raised during the talks between the senior military commanders. So according to the bureaucrat, apprehensions of a military escalation were often expressed during these meetings, and the board consensus was of a peaceful resolution of the crisis by avoiding any major provocation. These have no press releases or official reports to suggest that the Ladakh crisis was discussed in either the cabinet committee or on security or the full union cabinet. The two most powerful leaders in the government, Modi and Shah, that is respected PM Modi sir and respected Amit Shah sir, have maintained total silence on the subject, and communication between the armed forces and the political leadership, including Doval, changed with Rawat's untimely demise in December 2021. That is, as all of us are aware of that helicopter clash in which respected Bipin Rawat sir, his spouse, and various associated associated staff, military staff, had given up their lives in that helicopter clash. The communication lines between the two armies and the governments unfortunately remained open. The formal talks were held between the senior military commanders and diplomats, but there was no concrete progress. The telephone calls between the foreign ministers and special representatives did not yield any breakthrough. Bereft of options, the Indian government went back to the plans approved since the mid-1980s, a quid pro quo operation, which was also formally stated in a document, Non-Alignment 2.0, that is a foreign and strategic policy for India in the 21st century, which was produced in 2012 by the Center for the Policy Research with the support of the Manmohan Singh government, the then PM. There are several areas which the local tactical and operational advantage rests with us, it noted. These areas should be identified and earmarked for limited or offensive operations on our part. The Kailash range to the south of Pangong Lake was identified for a QPQ operation in August 2020 after the reserves for troops, ammunition, spares, stores and supplies had been stocked for any eventuality. So a sudden powerful transition to the offensive, the flashing sword of the vengeance is the greatest moment for the defense. The 19th century Prussian general Calvin Clausewitz wrote in a seminal text on war. The basic transition in Ladakh was indeed sudden, and at one point, with firing from both sides, the situation threatened to escalate. Besides rifles and machine guns, rockets were also fired. Fortunately, there were no known casualties. The Indian Army had, however, chosen to limit itself to occupying the peaks on the Kailash range, and it believed they were on its side of the line of actual control. The PLA responded by occupying the most dominating peak in the area, while moving on to the gaps in the range, as it asked the Indians to stop firing. From satellite imagery, Biggers noted that when India took to the ridges at Rezangla, which in some respects helped shift the center of gravity to Chosul, we saw self-propelled howitzers and other elements road poi from Galvan Valley and Konkala areas. So the two armies, that is the Indian Army and the Chinese Army, were now face to face with even tanks deployed by both sides barely a few meters apart. The threat of escalation was real and persistent, and apprehensions of an accidental configuration gave local commanders sleepless nights as I rewarded soldiers who had taken an aggressive stance against the PLA by opening fire. I was losing my hair worrying if this actually would go out of hand. The senior commander who handled the Ladakh crisis told me. After all, the threat of an escalation spiral between the two most populous countries in the world, that is India and China, was no small matter. It's a very, very big matter. Indians now had the upper hand in at least one place on the Kailash range, which led the PLA to start serious negotiations about the disengagement. Meetings between the foreign ministers and the defense ministers of the two countries were held in Moscow that September, but did not provide a breakthrough. The overall impasse continued through the winter without any further clashes or tactical moves. It thus came as a surprise when, in February 2021, two armies agreed to a barter deal of disengagement. Both sides, that is India and China, would withdraw from the Kailash range, which India had moved into, and the north block of the Pangong Lake, where the PLA had entered. A no patrol zone would have to be created on the north bank of the Pangong in the contested area, and the PLA would dismantle all the infrastructure it created there. So it would also erase the Chinese map, flag, and the slogan printed there earlier. There was great disappointment among the observers that India had agreed to barter away its trump card in the Kailash area for only the north bank of Pangong Lake, instead of seeking disengagement throughout Ladakh. The pressure created by moving into the Kailash range meant that India could not patrol up to Finger 8 at Pangong Lake, a distance of 10 kilometers, but it had also removed the Chinese presence from that area. At a public seminar this June, that is in 2022, at Delhi's India International Center, where I was part of the panel, Rakesh Sharma, and a Lieutenant General and former commander of the Ladakh Corps, argued vehemently that the PLA's occupation of the most dominant height in the area gave it a direct view and the basic domination of a major Indian access route, leaving the Indian army with no choice but to disengage its exchange for the north bank of the Pangong Lake. For the top officers directly involved in the QPQ operations and disengagement told me that the criticism of the disengagement plan was unfair. It is unrealistic to expect all the areas to be resolved in one go. The first officer, the military, who is the military commander involved in handling the Ladakh crisis, told me there was a great danger of escalation, and we had a basic role of prevention of that particular scenario. The second officer, the one posted at the army headquarters and who was present at the highest level of deliberations, invoked the basic principle of physics that every lever can move only an item of a certain weight, and this lever at Kailash only had this much leverage. You can even ask me why I did not get the problem in Arunachal Pradesh resolved with Kailash, but is that realistic? His second reason was even more striking. The North Bank was a basic priority for us because of its impact on the national morale, as the PLA had painted the China map and flag. He said, we wanted to get that removed. As I rewarded the soldiers who had taken an aggressive stance against the PLA by opening the fire, I was losing my hair, worrying if this was the great thing that would go out of my hand. The senior commander who handled the Ladakh crisis told, this is the basic highlight which I considered right to repeat, right? On 12th February 2021, the Defense Ministry announced that the outstanding issues would be taken up within 48 hours of completion of the Pangong Tso disengagement. By August, however, further disengagement had only been completed by PP-17A in Gogra. This left PP-15, Depsing and Demchok unresolved. The senior commander involved in the Ladakh crisis, who was actually the present officer in multiple rounds of negotiations with the PLA, confessed to me that Depsang and Demchok are currently tough to resolve. Excuse me. He said that at times when a resolution seemed close, the PLA, especially the overall political commissar present at talks, would sell the discussion rather quickly. So the overall stalling of the discussion at a quicker level would obviously mean that the overall topic of discussion or the topic on which we are discussing is quite meaningful and needs to be addressed at the quickest level with the utmost attention. The senior military officer from the army headquarters argued that it was a positive sign that the PLA had not undertaken any permanent construction at Depsang, but he had no hopeful news about Demchok, also known as Chardingla Nilong Nala Junction, other than claiming that the Chinese stance of denying the locals access to a local spring for the religious purposes was unreasonable and unacceptable. Demchok is one of the few areas in the Ladakh district that is claimed by China, but is controlled and inhabited by India. However, the PLA has already made it clear several times and had created some infrastructure there as well in the Demchok district, and this summer moved deeper to block the Indian grazers. Moreover, the Chinese have created an unpaved steep road from the south region to Chardingla, a 5,828 meter high pass on the line of actual control. This pass has basically been patrolled by the Indian Army, and the standoffs have been a regular feature in the area. According to Mr. Sharma, at the heart of the matter is the denial of the patrolling to the Chardingla district by the Indian patrols, and to arrive to a consensus for the buffer zone is not going to be actually easy, he further added, in this particular area. Since this crisis began, the massive upgradation of the military infrastructure by India in Ladakh and its revoltful action by the Chinese military forces has created massive headache for both regions. So with the current infrastructure and ongoing investments in the region, China has ensured that it can actually move forces quickly away to respond to any perceived threat posed by India. Biggers noted, pointing out the visible asymmetry between the respective sides forces and the relative speeds in which both sides appeared on the border. So even in the areas of disengagements, he said, the regional infrastructure in place also means the PLA ground force could quickly return to the areas where it previously occupied. So when I asked the senior commander dealing with Ladakh about this, he replied that our infrastructure has undergone massive improvement. If we had a foot track earlier, now we have a jeep-able track. Of course, I am not disrupting that I'm not disputing that the PLA has now has now become a 6-lane highway on the other side, but we are better off than we were earlier. Mr. Pandey said that since May 2020, a significant amount of enhancement in our infrastructure has taken place, especially in the context of Eastern Ladakh. He said that 350 company modules have been created in the area, capable of housing almost 35,000 troops. The focus, he added, has been on creating infrastructure and connectivity and bridges, and on constructing underground storage infrastructure for ammunition. The massive aggression in the Chinese infrastructure and military deployment in Ladakh has meant that New Delhi now knows there is little chance of returning to the situation that existed much before May 2020. When the journalist Ms. Suhasini Haidar asked Mr. Jaishankar in March this year if he had raised the restoration of the status quo ante as a demand with the visiting Chinese foreign minister, for Chinese Foreign Minister Mr. Wang Yi, he basically smiled and evaded the question. When an official of the National Security Council Secretariat was questioned by a scholar at a private event, he said that a disengagement and de-escalation should actually be seen as a restoration of the April 2020 status, but this logic implies a partial acceptance of the fate's accomplice enacted by China. If we define the status quo ante as that the PLA must pull back its soldiers from the areas where they had come in 2020 across our perception of the line of actual control, that is the more sort of practical undertaking that status quo ante is. Of what status quo ante is. Lieutenant General D.S. Hunda, a former chief of the Northern Command, told The Hindu. Why we need to insist on the status quo ante is basically because for me that is the only way you can get peace and calm back on the line of actual control. Otherwise we are not going to get it. Research by Dan Atman, an assistant professor of political science at Georgia State University, has shown that if a fait accompli is not quickly resisted or reversed, it becomes more difficult to do so over time. The aggressor consolidates and fortifies their position, establishing a new normal. Of 59 land grabs around the world, where the aggressor held territory at the end of the overall militarized international dispute, Altman finds 47 where the aggressor had the territory uninterrupted for the next decade. The odds are basically stacked against India. So, there has been a gradual decline in the bilateral ties between India and China. That's what we are witnessing from quite a number of months, specifically from last 2 years. So the decline was basically interposed with warning signs in the form of border standoffs in the Beijing district in 2013, Chamur in 2014, and Doklam in 2017. Under the Manmohan Singh government, the then PM, period of high economic growth and assured foreign policy resulted in New Delhi deciding to reverse its long-standing policy of treating the border areas with China as belonging to the overall periphery or serving as the buffer zones, hence preventing the ingress into the Indian hinterland. It was a drastic shift from the outpost mentality, which was bettered by the British and firmed up after the humiliating defeat to China in 1962. In 2006, the Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran recommended the reconstruction of several strategic roads in Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, and the related areas. He also proposed the revival of many advanced landing grounds that had been lying unused since 1962. After he retired in September that year, he was tasked to basically undertake a survey of infrastructure along the Chinese border, which then led to a plan for an extensive network of roads, bridges, and railway lines in Ladakh, Sikkim, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, and Arunachal Pradesh. The government approved the construction of 862 kilometers of strategic roads in the border areas. In 2008, the army basically started raising the new mountain divisions as well as armored artillery and infantry bridges for the Chinese border. Modern military equipment such as C-130J and C-17 transport aircraft was basically bought from the United States. This coincided with the global economic crisis of 2008, which had long-term political effects on the international order. While the United States failed to provide global leadership and was bogged down by its own domestic reasons, China's economic success basically encouraged Beijing to be more assertive. It rapidly expanded its overseas investments and became more confrontational over the territorial claims in the South China region, covering the South China Sea and the East China Sea as well. The change in China's hard power was accompanied by a greater willingness to demonstrate its use. The shift did not go unnoticed by New Delhi, which also noted the panicky Chinese response to the Tibetan uprising of 2008. It was around then that Xi Jinping took over as the vice president, delivering speeches over a more assertive China. This basically led to a top-level review in the Prime Minister's office, which was involving only the Cabinet Committee on Security, which identified the short window available to India to generate a hard power needed to deter China, as Beijing was eventually bound to turn its attention to the border dispute with India. That thinking was basically in good measure reflected in non-alignment 2.0 report, of which Saran was a co-author. There is the great possibility that China might resort to the territorial grabs the report started. The report started by the main reporting officers, right? The report started by the main reporting officers, and these facts were stated by them in a detailed manner. In either case, whether China resorts to a limited probe or to a larger offensive, our aim should basically be the restoration of status quo ante. A video frame of the footage recorded in the mid-June 2020 and released by China Central Television, showing Chinese foreground and Indian soldiers background during a clash in the Galvan Valley. This is the basic footage showing this is the basic footage of the video frame of the footage recorded in mid-June 2020 and released by China Central Television, showing Chinese foreground and Indian soldiers background during a clash in the Galvan Valley. So, dear friends, just now we have seen this image, as I have quite elaborated that this is the image of the video frame footage recorded in the mid-June 2020 and released by the China Central Television, showing the Chinese foreground amid the war between India and China, and the Indian soldiers in the background during a clash in the Galvan Valley. Right now, we will show another image to you. This image, it is a very peaceful image. Right now, let me describe this image to you as well. This image basically demonstrates the much hyped informal summit at Wuhan between Jinping Xi and Modi ji, only months after the Doklam crisis lulled New Delhi into believing that a modus vivendi had been found to reset the ties with China, that is, to smoothen the relationships, the bilateral strategic relationship between India and China. So, in 2013, the two countries signed a border defense cooperation agreement, the first to define every step to be taken by the two sides in case of any face-off on the line of actual control. The agreement was aimed at preventing the incidents involving tailing of the patrols and also generally steaming the channels of communication. It included a 5-layer mechanism for communications between the two sides, flag meetings between the border personnel on the line of actual control, meetings between the senior officers, periodic meetings at the ministry level, meetings of the workings mechanism for consultation and coordination on India-China border affairs, and India-China Annual Defense Dialogue. The government also provided the hotlines between the two countries' military headquarters, which have not been established till date. In practical terms, this meant that the soldiers from both sides got used to the idea that firing weapons on the line of actual control was taboo, leading to the unfortunate outcome that various other means of inflicting violence came to be devised and used. That year, the Manmohan Singh government sanctioned the raising of a new mountain strike corps for the Chinese border, but that process was truncated by the Modi government in 2018. Citing paucity of funds and greater focus on the optimization of existing arrangements, the Narendra Modi government raised only one of the two proposed divisions. This corps has now been assigned responsibilities in the eastern sector with an offensive role looking into the Tibet matter. Several serving and retired military officers told me that India's accretion of troops and improved infrastructure on the Chinese border meant that by the end of the first decade of the century, the Indian army was able to send out patrols to the line of actual control in greater strength and high frequency. These patrols basically started, I repeat, these patrols basically started regularly visiting areas that Indian forces were not going to earlier, bringing down into contact with PLA patrols more often. The number of border transgressions and face-offs between the two armies shot up, but the existing protocols and arrangements were able to resolve these minor wrangles. At the bilateral meetings, the PLA began complaining about the Indian border infrastructure and proposed a freeze on the new construction by either side. This was actually rejected by New Delhi, as the Chinese had already constructed massive border infrastructure in Tibet and India was only playing the catch-up. The picture which we have just seen, this, where respected Modi ji and Xi Jinping are being seen in a very peaceful conversation where they are strolling in a garden and having a peaceful talk with each other. Today's President Xi Jinping, today's Modi tweets, the respected President Xi Jinping and I continued our overall deliberations this morning. Here are some pictures from the walk along Wuhan's East Lake. We discussed multiple aspects of bilateral ties between our nations. He basically tweeted it on April 28, 2018. But I'm very sorry to say the 2020 incidents has poured water on all the peaceful conversations between India and China. And God knows the fate of these two countries. And as of now, we are aware the entire geopolitical conflicts, the entire global crisis we are going through. And many countries are actually removing their setup from China, or are even thinking to finish their relationship with China. And they have developed a lot of distrust in the Chinese economy. God knows the fate of the Chinese economy, what is going to happen in future. And on the other hand, the countries who are removing their setup, or are thinking to remove their setup from China, they are considering India and Vietnam as their next best thought out options to set up their manufacturing operations, to outsource their operations. Also, along with this geopolitical crisis, the supply chain disruptions, the overall turmoil being created in the international transactions worldwide, this COVID-19 pandemic, which is going on from last 2.5 years, the entire balance has got disturbed in the international trade, or the global economy is basically going through a phase of turmoil, a phase of major turmoil. But only what can prevent us, what can save us? A peaceful, stable state of mind, guided in a correct direction, with a very, very far-sighted and visionary approach, with a peaceful, dynamic, and a perseverant leadership pattern. And this type of pattern is being exhibited by our country, and that's what we have been discussing in our previous sessions as well. The nations worldwide are looking at India, with great pride. Along with being very rich in terms of cultures, diversity, being a multicultural, rich, diverse country. Its overall fragrance is actually attracting the countries worldwide in these times of instability. And just imagine, just think, had these times been completely normal, how would India's GDP or other related economic figures point out, right? Or how our overall international trade relationships enhanced if the overall global situation had been in a very favorable position. Had we not been undergoing such tough global times of uncertainty, instability, and great sensitivity because of this geopolitical crisis, supply chain disruption, or COVID-19 pandemic. So obviously, a nation which can sustain the crisis in a well-balanced manner is a successful nation. The same thing holds true for a stable-minded individual. So let's come back to our current topic of today's discussion. India's renewed attempt after 2009 to actually exercise control up to its claim line was resented by the PLA. The Lieutenant Governor Praveen Bakshi, a former chief of the Eastern Command, said at a 2018 event on the Doklam crisis that the senior PLA officers had complained about this to their Indian counterparts. The commander who handled the Ladakh crisis told me that during the recent senior commander talks, the PLA leadership again complained that the Indian Army never used to patrol the areas that it has been regularly trying to access for the past 12 years. This was basically independently confirmed to me by a renowned US-based academic who had spent a few days with the senior PLA leadership in Beijing in 2019. The PLA top brass complained about Indian aggression and attempts to cross the LAC, that is the academic the academic representative said, and even afforded to show footage recorded by the drones. The academic added that the PLA was keen to teach India a lesson and put it in a place, particularly after the Doklam standoff in 2017. At Doklam, Indian troops basically stopped a Chinese road construction party from entering the Bhutanese 73 days and was resolved after political interventionists claimed a win for New Delhi, but it was clear within a year that the PLA had never left the area. Instead, it had deployed in great strength and constructed impressive infrastructure to house the PLA, seemed to have learned, more importantly, the PLA seemed to have learned the lessons from Doklam, which it slipped in Ladakh. It deployed in the larger numbers rather quickly, taking the Indian army by surprise, and has maintained an assertive stance throughout. It also learned of the Indian leadership's desire to claim a domestic propaganda victory, even at a cost of real victory, a weakness Beijing has exploited fully in Ladakh. And dear friends, this is another image which we are seeing. This is basically an image where the Indian soldiers patrolling an area near Pangong Lake, Ladakh during the 1962 Sino-Indian War. So the much hyped informal summit at Wuhan between Xi and Modi, only months after the Doklam crisis, lulled New Delhi into believing that the modus vivendi had been found to reset the ties with China. Both leaders promised to provide the strategic guidance to their militaries in order to prevent any further border crisis. And the academic added that the PLA was keen to teach India a lesson and put it in its place, particularly after the Doklam standoff in 2017. As the Indian Army devised the new procedures and drills after the Wuhan to prevent clashes with the PLA, including joint patrols and struggled patrols, a senior military officer leading the process at the time told me that major differences existed in Ladakh, where the prospect of such measures succeeding was dim. His words were indeed prophetic, demonstrating that the much wanted Wuhan spirit had almost immediately turned to ether. India's options to reverse China's gains in Ladakh are shrinking, with nearly 50,000 additional troops delayed. The Indian Army has done well to prevent any further PLA progress in Ladakh after 2020. This has been done by actually redeploying and reorienting the equivalent of 6 divisions after the Pakistan border. According to the senior officer at the army headquarters, the crisis has forced the PLA to deploy its troops close to the line of actual control, bringing them out of their comfort zone. He was confident about matching the Chinese at both the tactical and operational levels in a conflict, but was uncertain about PLA's prowess in cyber and electromagnetic spectrum warfare. There were also concerns about the major gaps in the military deployment in certain border areas of Arunachal Pradesh. In conversations about Ladakh with many senior military officers, I encountered a curious mix of difference and diffidence and bluster when it came to the Chinese military. Officers would be quite dismissive by the PLA soldier response, but the flinch of the prospect of a military escalation with China. New Delhi seems content holding the line and is not displaying any intent to reverse the Chinese ingress on the LAC. We will actually make sure any misadventure by the adversary does not take place again. The Lieutenant General Upendra Dwivedi, the chief of the Northern Commandment, told the journalists, "We also have strategic patience, and we are also ready to wait," he added. "We are ready for a negotiation. So, if it is prolonged, we are going to wait." This comes from worries about an unaltered escalation and an inadvertent escalation in case New Delhi attempts another QPQ operation across the line of actual control. A successful QPQ operation would allow India to get back to the negotiating table with a stronger hand and better chance of striking a favorable deal. Excuse me. So, there has been a declining frequency of talks between the senior commanders of the two armies. The last two rounds were basically held in March and July this year after several requests by India. The talks at lower levels held more frequently can reduce the risks locally but are actually incapable of making progress on the broader agenda. The academic added that the PLA has been keen to teach India a lesson and put it in its place, particularly after the Doklam standoff in 2017. I repeated this particular highlight because it's of extreme significance for the Indian economy as a whole. So, India pinned all its hopes on military and diplomatic talks, leading to the disengagement in all areas, which means increased separation of soldiers away from an eyeball to eyeball confrontation and instead kept to a few kilometers apart by creating no patrol zones. But this process of this arrangement has largely been limited to the Indian side of the line of actual control, which denies India the control it had exercised over its territory. Now, going forward, my friends, further discussing the bilateral nature of the strategic ties between India and China. As per the Indian scheme of the things, this engagement is to be followed by the de-escalation in which the two sides, India and China, will take heavy military equipment and troops a few hours away from the front line. The PLA has, however, flatly refused to consider de-escalation, while the Indian side talks about an equivalence in the number of hours taken to deploy. The Chinese have insisted on stepping back by an equal distance. This is basically military. This is basically disadvantageous if we talk on the stand of the Indian military side. It is quite disadvantageous at that end. But if we take a holistic picture, the things would turn to the other round. So while the Indian sides talk about an equivalence in the number of hours taken to deploy, the Chinese have insisted on stepping back by an equal distance. This is actually quite disadvantageous to India if we talk on the side of the military angle. As the China's superior border infrastructure would allow it to deploy troops faster over the similarly smaller distances. That leaves the third and final step of the induction. This would actually mean moving all additional troops of Ladakh entirely. Having moved a division-sized Rashtriya Rifles force from Udhampur to southern Ladakh, the Indian Army is actually in no mood or reposition to remove from the theatre all forces that were relocated there after April 2020. Even if the PLA were to agree to India's three-step process, the questions posed by the newly constructed Chinese infrastructure, allowing faster operational deployment and its induction of the modern technology, remain unaddressed. Because trust has completely broken down, this engagement will provide at best a tactical pause in which in what is clearly emerging as a complex strategic challenge from China. The challenge basically emerges from yawning power gap between the two neighbors. China's economy is actually 5 times the size of India's, and its defense spending is almost 4 times as high. So technologically, China has made massive inroads in all spheres, leaving India far behind. Geopolitically, it actually pitches and sees itself as a rising peer to a declining United States, and Xi's stated aim is to achieve the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation by 2049. This is the point at which Beijing hopes to assume a leading position in the international order. The way the balance of power has shifted towards China in the 8 years of the Modi government raises even more serious questions about the future of bilateral ties. 60 years after the 1962 Sino-India War sent the message to Asia that China was a superior power to India, the Ladakh crisis has actually unequivocally conveyed to South Asia that New Delhi is not a match for Beijing. Sri Lanka's response to the docking of the China's satellite monitoring vessel Yan Wang 5 at one of its ports in August this year, despite loud public protests by New Delhi, was a confirmation. It was actually a confirmation that it was actually a confirmation of that reality. It just means power speaks. But we should never lose hope. The situation is no better in Nepal, especially after the controversy over the recruitment of Gurkhas into the Indian Army after the short-term contractual Agnipath scheme. Despite the current government's stated neighborhood first policy, the last 8 years have been more tough, and hence a lot of troughs and crests in India's engagement with its South Asian neighbors. In 2016, Modi pulled out of the annual meeting of the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, that is SAARC, the only forum for South Asian cooperation over the Uri attack, that is the Ukraine-Russia attack, in an effort to isolate Pakistan in the region. Despite the attempts to promote the Bay of Bengal initiative for multi-sectoral technical and economic cooperation and the Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal initiative, Delhi has been unable to replace the SAARC with a substantive alternative. The basic inability to match China's deep pockets or major infrastructure projects, combined with resentment against India's overall technical setup, perceived as a regional bully, has meant that New Delhi's sphere of dominance has shrunk to a much diminished sphere of influence in South Asia. The basic problem becomes more vexed because of the Modi government's Hindutva-driven policy towards Pakistan. Before the Ladakh crisis, leaders of the ruling BJP vocal in invoking and attracting Pakistan during the political speeches and election campaigns. So, the basic risk of activating a two-front collusive military threat from China and Pakistan, which India is basically incapable of handling, has basically coerced them into silence on Pakistan since the Ladakh crisis began. Back-channel talks with Pakistan by using the United Arab Emirates have delivered the basic reiteration of the ceasefire along the line of control, that is the LOC, but the ongoing economic and political volatility in Pakistan, with a new army chief scheduled to take over in November 2022, that is in this month itself, could actually disrupt the quietude so far, in which Pakistan has not taken overt advantage of India's weakening hand vis-a-vis China. So the way ahead for India is quite simple. Instead of leaving Pakistan to be dealt with only by security and intelligence czars, New Delhi needs to bring diplomacy, politics and economics into play. The Indian establishment should be built rather than be burned. Bridges with Pakistan. So we need to build the bridges with Pakistan rather than burning them. A substantive peace building process with Pakistan would leave New Delhi free to focus on the strategic challenge posed by China rather than always looking over its shoulder towards its neighbor Pakistan to prevent another crisis. SARC, that is the Association of the South Asian Countries for Regional Cooperation, ought to be a chosen vehicle for this engagement because it would draw in other regional countries into the debate, making them all stakeholders in the process of regional peace, stability, and development. So, the Modi government cannot avoid SARC because of the apprehension that the group's other members. So, my dear friends, as we have been witnessing, the way ahead for India is actually quite simple because of its extraordinary, extremely dynamic, and far-sighted visionary leadership pattern. Instead of leaving Pakistan to be dealt with only by security and intelligence czars, New Delhi needs to be more diplomatic, political, and economical. The Indian establishment should build rather than burn the bridges with Pakistan. And a substantive peace building process with Pakistan would leave New Delhi free to focus on the strategic challenges posed by China rather than always looking over its shoulder towards Pakistan to prevent another crisis. And the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, that is SARC, ought to be a chosen vehicle for its engagement because it would draw in other regional countries into the debate, making them all stakeholders in the process of regional peace, stability, and development. The Modi government cannot avoid the SARC, that is the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, because of the apprehension that the group's other members will combine to have China enter as a full member. And the Modi government led by our respected PM Mr. Narendra Modi ji cannot avoid the SARC because of the apprehension that the group's other members will combine to have China enter as a full member. So with Asia and the Indo-Pacific now the center of gravity of emerging global geopolitics, India will have to be prepared to deal with a lot of players, and a lot of players are awaited in the near future for power in its neighborhood and learn to play the game deftly. As the former National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon has argued, the more the overall uncertainty in the global system, the higher the priority that India should accord to stabilizing and managing its immediate periphery, particularly the subcontinent. I repeat, the more the overall uncertainty in the global system, the higher the priority that Indians should actually accord to the overall stabilizing and managing in its immediate periphery, particularly the subcontinent of India. And dear friends, again, I would like to remind all of you, I'm in the hospital, so the noise or disturbances in our background is actually unavoidable. So I request you people to please cooperate and let's focus on our current topic of discussion. So here it goes. So besides the internal rebalancing of its military away from Pakistan border and towards China, New Delhi has also attempted external rebalancing in the region, particularly by engaging with the reinvigorated quadrilateral security dialogue, which also includes Australia, Japan, the United States. Quad summits as well as the ministerial and other official meetings have devised a non-security agenda with a lot of statements, but none of the proposals ameliorate India's precarious condition on its border with China. So, as I was saying, that none of these proposals basically ameliorate India's precarious condition on its border with China. India remains the only Quad member in this quadrilateral circle that shares the land and border with China and is not a treaty ally of the United States. The Modi government seems hesitant to embrace a hard line towards China as it fears provoking Beijing into a military escalation on the land border. New Delhi also runs the risk of creating an impression where China starts looking at India as only a subset of its US challenge. However, it has done enough on the Ukraine-Russia issue that goes against the West's directions and mirrors China's actions to keep Beijing puzzled about India's real partners and basic patrons. India's real partners and the real patrons. In a podcast I recorded with Zhou Bo, a retired senior colonel in the PLA, he was basically insistent that India has a record of following a strategic sovereignty and is pursuing that path on the Ukraine issue as well. India's long-standing ties with Russia, including its extensive dependency on Russia for defense goods and replacements, have made it impossible for New Delhi to sign up for the West's angry policies towards Moscow. A former Indian ambassador to Russia had said that since nearly 70% of Indian military equipment of Russian origin will be in service for decades, Moscow's support is basically necessary for New Delhi. Even as Moscow becomes a junior partner of Beijing, the Modi government is left with no option but to hope that Russia will not succumb to China's pressure and will maintain its independent ties with India. So if there is one thing the Ladakh crisis has taught us, it is that Modi's personalized diplomacy with Xi has been an abysmal failure. Please excuse me. So, even though the meetings between the defense and foreign ministers of India and China took place on the sidelines of 2020 SCO meeting at Moscow, Indian officials claimed that they did not allow any Russian presence at those meetings. A junior diplomat at the Indian embassy in Moscow told me that Russia's attempts in 2021 to act as a broker between Beijing and New Delhi on the border crisis were politely turned down. A junior diplomat at the Indian embassy in Moscow told me that Russia's attempts in 2021 to act as a broker between Beijing and New Delhi on the border crisis were politely turned down. So by participating in the SCO and BRICS summits and attending the Vostok 2022 military exercises with China and Russia, India has signaled an independent engagement that does not bracket in Moscow with Beijing. If things go south between India and China, Modi's assumptions over the relative strength of New Delhi's and Beijing's ties with Moscow would be put on a severe test. Yes, you have heard me right. It will be a severe test. So, having succeeded under the old international order, both India and China are navigating their way through their turbulence, that is, the new turbulent phase between the two global orders. A bigger and more powerful China, which disputes its land borders with India, is a reality. Yes, it's a reality, a harsh reality. New Delhi will have to contend with. However, loudly Modi may claim that under him India has become a Vishwa Guru, an Atmanirbhar and an Atmanirbhar Vishwa Guru, a self-reliant Vishwa Guru. And as it's also said in Hindi, a proverb in Hindi, Sach to bitho nach. So it is a Atmanirbhar self-guru, self-reliant Vishwa Guru, world leader. And that's why we are very proud of such a dynamic and an extremely far-sighted leadership, and every other nation is actually appreciating our really extraordinary leadership efforts, and every nation is actually looking at us and trying to reach us, trying to build international trade relations with us, despite of the uncertain global economic scenario, which is intensifying and is expected to intensify more and more in the coming times. So, coming back to the session, having succeeded under the old international order, both India and China are navigating their way through this turbulent new phase between the two global orders. A bigger and more powerful China, which disputes its land borders with India, is a reality now. The region of New Delhi is actually contended to be in dispute with China. However loudly Mr. Modi may claim that under him India has become a Vishwaguru, so a euphemism for India has a euphemism for superpower India. Beijing is not going to accept that New Delhi is its geopolitical peer, or rather a rival, a competitive rival. It will not accept that. It is a game of hard power, of economics, of militaries, of technology, of politics, of geopolitics, in which India trails China. The National Congress of the Communist Party of China will likely rubber stamp Xi's third term at China's helm is unlikely to bring a major change in that dynamic for India. New Delhi is actually caught in a tough spot, and if it wishes to secure its interests, the current policy of being fearful of China, ignoring the panda in the room and hoping that this too shall pass, will not work. As John F. Kennedy said during the Berlin crisis of 1961, we cannot negotiate with the people who say, what's mine is mine, what's yours is negotiable. The short-term clever fixes from the Modi government, which try to basically anesthetize the domestic fallout in India for the reasons of political optics by creating an ambiguity about the crisis will hurt India sooner rather than later. I repeat, New Delhi is caught in a tough spot and it wishes to secure its interests. The current policy of being fearful of China, ignoring the panda in the room and hoping that this too shall pass, will not work. As John F. Kennedy said during the Berlin crisis of 1961, we cannot negotiate with the people who say, what's mine is mine, what's yours is negotiable. The short-term clever fixes from the Modi government, which try to anesthetize the domestic fallout in India for the reasons of political optics by creating an ambiguity about the crisis, will hurt India sooner rather than later. Ambiguity, ambivalence, and confusion always serve the interests of a bigger power, in this case China's. Modi should have learned that lesson when PLA soldiers rolled into Jumur in Ladakh, even as he entertained Xi on a swing on the Sabarmati riverfront in Ahmedabad in September 2014. Instead, Modi extolled Xi Jinping, saying he was the second most important Chinese person to visit India after the 7th century Buddhist pilgrim Xuanzang. He has met Xi Jinping 17 times since but could not secure much for India. So, if there is one thing the Ladakh crisis has taught us, it is that Mr. Modi's personalized diplomacy with Xi Jinping that has been abysmal failure. That failure casts a long and dark shadow over India's China challenge. So, my dear friends, as we have discussed the great insights of the trade relationship, of the bilateral ties, the bilateral strategic ties between the two emerging nations, the two emerging economies, India and China. So, we have also read the critics pointed out by the author for our current PM, Mr. Modi. But we know that our nation is able to cross this period, is able to tackle this tough time, is able to cross this great global storm. The entire global economy has been put into with great amount of confidence, and only the caliber of Mr. Modi is able to help India achieve the unachievable. And as quoted, the glorious 75 years of India's independence, marked by our 75 years of independence, marked by our 75th year of, marked by this 15th August 2022, which also calls for Amrit Mahotsav, where we propagated the theme of outmanoeuvred, that is self-reliance. This very strongly voices every Indian's innate desire to be self-reliant, every Indian's desire for the theme to enhance the motive, to enhance the thought of Make in India. That basic theme is so provoking, is so inspiring, and that and the current government is actually giving the platform to every Indian to enhance in this particular arena, right? And also, as all of us know, that India, being a mixed economy, is prospering on its primary sector, for which, as of now, it's a dire need to excel and actually productivize and actually capitalize on the overall technology, that is the manufacturing sector. Overall technology, we need to upgrade our agricultural sector, we need to upgrade our primary sector, and the overall economic development will lie on this particular concept. Side by side, as far as the tertiary sector is concerned, the overall demographic dividend of our country is so inspiring, and it talks laurels about us. The way we have been serving our countrymen throughout this COVID pandemic, and the way we have been able to self-sustain ourselves, not only self-sustain ourselves but also help our peers after this, the recent crisis of the Ukraine-Russia war, which has led to the entire supply chain disruptions. the excellent way in which we helped Sri Lanka to stand again on its toes, as it had undergone a major crisis. Its existence was put to a major question mark, and we, as a friend, helped Sri Lanka to sustain itself. So this means we are excelling a lot in the aspect of tertiary sector also. That is, we are making the holistic development a reality. And whatever pictures we have seen whatever pictures we have seen in our session of the interaction of our Prime Minister, respected Modi sir, with the China's President, Mr. Xi Jinping, it just illustrates the fact that our respected Modi sir has been very, very keen to strengthen the ties with China, to engage in the peaceful talks, to forget the past and start a new relationship, to put a full stop to whatever has happened up till now, and give a new start. But the things have to turn the other way around in the year 2020. And since then, we also had to get very cautious in actually maintaining our overall relationships, overall international trade relationships with China. And now, if we consider the current global scenario, it's quite challenging, where China also has a very, very major role to play in spreading chaos, in spreading a lot of turmoil. So we have to act very, very cautiously, and we are proud to be led under the leadership of Mr. Modi and under the presidentship of Mrs. Draupadi Murmuji. This is our fate. This is our fortune. This is our precious fate. We should be really proud of. Every Indian should be proud of. And my dear friends, our rich, diverse culture has not only produced the acumens, for India, but also, as we can see, Mr. Rishi Sunak, he is also the Indian product, who is the Prime Minister of United Kingdom. And in this tough turmoil, in this tough global turmoil, in this tough global time, though India has replaced United Kingdom for the first time as the fifth leading nation in terms of the GDP, that is the gross domestic product, but still at this time the citizens of United Kingdom have trusted a lot on this great personality. He is the third chosen Prime Minister in the tenure of just 2 months, and the citizens of UK have entrusted Mr. Rishi Sunak to bring them out of this global turmoil, and when UK is itself undergoing such a crisis, such a political and economic crisis, this speaks a lot about India. And we should be really proud of our country. We should be really proud of our leaders. Yes. I would again like to repeat my quote, which I mentioned in my session as well, and I would like to end with that quote: "Sach to bitho nach." Thank you so much. Namaste.